I've been coming to America for many years, ever since I started I hitchhiked across the country in 1963 when it was safe to do so, and became enraptured by America, I think, from that point onwards. And I think the moment that really consolidated this infatuation with the country was when I was given an assignment sometime in the 70s, I think, to go to all the places in America that are called paradise. There are 18 towns called paradise in this country, stretching from Paradise close to Intercourse, Pennsylvania, which of course always excites people, to a retirement community outside Sacramento. But between them, there are 16 other communities, all of which have suffered one way or another from the depredations of modern American society and are no longer fairly to be described as paradises, with the exception of one. And that one is almost exactly in the geographical center of the continental United States. And I went there and went to the post office and said, I'm a reporter from England and I'm just doing a piece on paradise. And the postmistress said, well, the postmaster, apparently all people that run post offices are called postmasters in this country, male or female. Well, you have to stay with, it was a community of 110 people, I think, with the Angels. John and Mary Angel have been living in paradise in this particular state for generations, and I stayed with them, and Mary Angel went to the bottom of her garden and took cherries from a tree and baked me a cherry pie. And I thought, that is the apotheosis, the exemplar of everything that is good about America. It's optimism, it is enthusiasm, it's a sense of sort of rapture and pleasure about being in this extraordinary country. So eventually, actually on the 4th of July, Independence Day 2011, I, having applied some years before, became a citizen and can now vote and do all those good things. Well, thank you, please. But so I'm part of the great mosaic of the A pluribus unum business. And I thought I would like to write a book about the America that I've liked for so long. But how to do it? I mean, as I was describing to some people from the History Channel earlier on, I, for many months, worried about how to do it. Should it be a sort of a hymn to my love for this country? Should it be, I have a fascination with railway trains, and so I thought I would cross America from coast to coast on Class 3 railways, which is possible to do from Eastport in Maine to a little town in Northern California, but they said no. And we also had this idea, which actually the History Channel thought was a rather good idea, which is to base the book structure on Gray's Anatomy. So you'd look at the brains of America being the universities, and the bones being the steel and concrete infrastructure, and the nerves being the communication system, and the blood vessels being the freeways and so on and so forth. But my editor took a much less liberal view than the History Channel and said, no, this was too much of a contrived idea, we're not going to do that. Think of another scheme. And I came up finally with the idea of exploring the notion of unity, how this country has managed, despite the unpleasantness of the 1860s, to remain a unified nation. I mean, if you, despite the best efforts of the European Union architects, Europe is manifestly not united. If you plug in your electric shaver or your iPhone in Spain, you'll need a different thing from what you'll need to use in Scandinavia. And they speak different languages too. So the notion of unity within Europe or within Africa or within India, where I lived for many years, or China, where I lived for a dozen years, it just doesn't work. But in this country, despite it being this astonishing mosaic of peoples and races and religions, it manages to hold together pretty remarkably, whether you live in Maine or Oregon or California or Texas. Well, Texas is a bit of a bit odd. It nonetheless all sort of hangs together and has done essentially since the foundation of this country. Well, how has it happened? Well, it hasn't happened because the country is all the same. I mean, Norway hangs together because all Norwegians are essentially ethnically and religiously and in outlook the same. I can argue this point up and down the road, but this country is on the face of it, disunited, and yet it's managed to cling together. How has that happened? And it's happened essentially through the agency of humankind. People, most of them long forgotten, have made decisions, have come up with innovations which have annealed this country into one in a way which has managed to endure. And so I decided that I would write a book called, and my wife gave me the title, just casually, it seemed to work very well though, of The Men Who United the States. So who were these people? And I'm afraid, and I'm distressed that I have to confess to the women in this room, that there are essentially no women in this story of the people who actually united the country. I mean, and I'm not obviously talking about things like voting rights and the notion of democracy or the language we speak. I'm talking about the physical unification of this country. So I divided it in the end. I mean, I didn't quite know how to work out the structure, but in the end, because my wife is Japanese and I spent a lot of time in the Far East, I decided on the enduring nature of the 5 basic elements of, well, I'm sure you can all name them, but anyway, wood, earth, water, fire, and metal. And using those 5 elements, some societies have only 4, some have 6, but these basic 5, you can quite simply divide the people, these men that united the states, along these 5 lines. As an example, wood, the way we did it is that in the early part of America's existence, it was a country covered with primeval forests, through which, on Jefferson's instructions, Lewis and Clark and the other explorers in their wooden canoes and so forth crossed the country from the Missouri to what is now Astoria, Oregon. Earth was the early geologists who worked out not just where the country was and what it looked like superficially, but what lay underneath it, what wealth would lure the people west, which gave rise to the pioneering spirit, the Oregon Trail, the California Trail, and so on. Water is the early travels along the American rivers, and then the canalization of those rivers with things like the Manchester Canal in New Hampshire, and the Erie Canal, of course, is a hugely important Erie Canal linking the Great Lakes to New York City, and the big canals in Chicago. And similarly, once you get onto fire, you're talking about the people these fire-breathing devices like motor cars and aeroplanes and railway trains, of course, most importantly, that crossed America hither and yon and rapidly and knitted these countries together commercially and rapidly. And finally, metal, which brings it very much up to date and into the realm that the 2 previous speakers have been talking about. We're talking about the copper wire and the telegraph wires that led to Samuel Morse's invention of the telegraph, and then the telephone, and then radio and television, and of course the internet. And within each of these fields, there were extraordinary people or long-forgotten towns that I revive, if you like, in the book and remind people how remarkable these innovators were. I mean, to give you an example, going to the very first chapter, when I travel across the country by air, the magazine's boring and the person you're sitting next to is tedious beyond belief. You look out of the window, and once I'm perhaps west of the Mississippi River, you see the straight lines of the farm sections, the roads, arrow straight north and south and arrow straight east and west. And you know from what you learned at school that they're all exactly 1 mile apart. And so if you count how fast they pass the line of vision in the window, you can work out exactly how fast the aeroplane is traveling and consequently what time you're likely to arrive in San Francisco. So I do that as a sort of hobby when I'm bored. But once I've got this surplus of information, presumably that little conceit will go out of the window too. But anyway, where did all this begin? Well, it begins in a place that probably many of you will not remember, never been to, but I've spent quite a lot of time in, called East Liverpool, Ohio. And East Liverpool, you laugh, I mean, have you been to East Liverpool, Ohio? Well, in that case, maybe it's your hometown. It's a pretty broken down example of the American Rust Belt. It's on the Ohio River. And the reason it's hugely important in the story of America is that there's an obelisk in the town just to the east on the banks of the Ohio River, which was established in 1785 on the orders of Thomas Jefferson, who made this stupendously important decision that Americans should be allowed to own land. I mean, this was an extraordinary notion. Land was not something that ever anyone in Britain used to own. The church owned the land, the king owned the land, the aristocracy was occasionally given land by the king, but the ordinary people never owned it. And Jefferson said, this is ridiculous. American people, we've got tons of land, let us sell it to them. They can own it, they can sell it, and we can levy taxes on it, which we can then use for the running of the government. I mean, it's a simple, elegant solution to a problem on how to raise money for governments. But, okay, to sell the land, you've got to organize the land into parcels to be sold. Well, the original 13 colonies were a higgledy-piggledy mess of estates and plantations where this system hadn't been brought into operation. But once Jefferson got going with his land ordinance of 1785, he said, let us survey the land and let us lay out a plat of America west of the Ohio River, which we can start selling to people. But we've got to have a point of beginning where America is measured from. And they decided it would be measured from this obelisk, which they put up in East Liverpool, Ohio. And at this point, there's a line going north and south up to the North Pole, and there's a line going east and west out to the Pacific Ocean, which Jefferson in those days realized would probably one day be part of American territory. And from there, all America is measured. It's called the point of beginning. And the first surveys were conducted in the early 1780s, and there were sales offices set up here in New York, $1 an acre. And the whole system of the 640 squares, the bottom 40 acres and a mule and all that kind of thing was born in this place called East Liverpool. And there are places like this dotted all over America. That's the origin, if you like, of, and that's when Jefferson came up with this idea of sending Lewis and Clark over to see what America was made of. You probably know the story, that he was in 1802 sitting in Monticello. He opened a book that he'd been sent from London about a Scotsman called Mackenzie, who had crossed the North American continent on foot and had painted a rock near Bella Coola, which is in British Columbia, saying across Canada on foot, I think it was 92 or something, and he had made a poultice of bear grease and iron filings or something, and this remained on the rock for many, many years. Mackenzie went back home, wrote a book about it. A copy of it was sent to Jefferson. He was incensed that a Canadian would be the first person to cross the North American continent, and said to his secretary, Meriwether Lewis, you will cross the country. And so Lewis recruited Clark, and the two of them engaged in this remarkable expedition. So once having decided what its extent was, then it was up to the next generation of innovators, if you like, no longer explorers hacking their way through forests, but men, topographical engineers, and geologists to see what America was made of. And believe you me, the gang of extraordinary people that was involved in this, it beggars belief. The famous four that did the big surveys in the 1860s and 1870s, John Wesley Powell, who discovered the Grand Canyon, Hayden, who discovered Yellowstone National Park. But to me, the most curious is this wonderful man, Clarence King. I don't know if any of you know about Clarence King, but to give you an example of King's life, I mean, he was a diminutive man from Newport, Rhode Island, aristocratic. He went to Yale. He did a PhD at Harvard in this relatively new science of geology. He was given at the age of 27 the task of doing what was called the great survey of the 40th parallel. It took him 7 years. And at the end of those 7 years, he was made the first ever director of the United States Geological Survey. Well, that's all fine and dandy. But his personal life is what intrigued me, because in all of these cases, innovators today, I don't know, they tend to be, well, whether they're bland or interesting or eccentric, I don't know, but nearly all of the people involved in the early story of America were really weird. And Clarence King is a very good example. Clarence King, and if any of you know this story, please interrupt me, but as I say, a diminutive white Rhode Island aristocrat, well-educated, well-born. He had this thing about native, as he called them, native women. He did not like white women. He thought white women looked like corpses, and he would only have romantic, how can I say it, on TED, and he would only sleep with dark-skinned women. Well, when he retired from the US Geological Survey, of which, as I say, he was the first director, John Wesley Powell was the second, he was walking, he lived in New York at the time in a residential hotel on 11th Street, not far away from where we are today, and he was walking through Riverside Park and saw a black woman that was, as far as he believed, the creature of his dreams. And he went up to her and said, "Madam, I am," and there must have been a brief moment of hesitation at this point, because he did not say Clarence King. He said, "My name is James Todd. And although I may look white, I'm not actually. I'm black, I'm pale-skinned, and I'm a Pullman porter. I work on the Pullman trains, which, as you probably know, is a profession reserved for black people. And can I take you to dinner?" Well, she accepted. She was from a slave family, Chattahoochee in Georgia. The two of them, Ada Copeland, her name was, the two of them had dinner. One thing led to her mother, as they say, and they married. And they had 5 children. And he, from that point on, lived a total double life. He would go to his office in New York as a white man, and having been absent for a month, would say he had been on a geological field trip. And he would say to his wife, who lived over in Brooklyn, "I've got to go and work on the California Zephyr, so I'll be back in a month." And for the next 20 years of his life, he lived half of his life as a white man, working still as a geologist and as a consultant and a mining engineer, and the other half living in Brooklyn and then ultimately in Queens as a black man and raising a family. And of course, Mendel, the truth comes out in the genes, because of the 5 children, 1 was white, 1 was black, and 3 were sort of an evident mixture. Mrs. King made no remark about this, and she never knew what the situation was until he was on his deathbed. He died in, I think, 1902, and the doctor who attended him, he went to Albuquerque, he was dying of tuberculosis, he confessed that his name was not James Todd, he was Clarence King, and he was not black, he was white, and perhaps his wife should be told back in Brooklyn that her name was not Todd, it was actually King. And very kindly, and I think it's one of the sort of underlying themes of this book, in a way, that the doctor was a compassionate and decent human being who decided that when he filled in on the form when King died, the race offered, Caucasian, black, Native American, and Pacific Islander, or whatever. He scratched them all out and put the race of the man who had died simply as being American. So stories like this infest this book and this story of the making of America. I could tell 1,001 of them, but I want to leave you just with one thought rushing us forward into the 20th century of a man who I dare say most of you will not have heard of, called Aubrey Fessenden. He was the first man ever to broadcast voice on radio. You know that Marconi invented the radio, or, well, there are counterclaims. But I just want you to imagine a night. It was Christmas night, 1906. And this man, Fessenden, sitting underneath an enormous radio aerial, a place called Brant Rock, Massachusetts, not far from Plymouth Rock, where the Plymouth Brethren landed. He had sent a telegraph message. At that point, only Morse code was transmitted over the radio. And he had sent a message by Morse to all the ships belonging to the United Fruit Company that were bringing bananas up from Honduras to the ports on the east coast of America, that at midnight they were to listen on their radio sets for a transmission which would be unusual. And I just think, if you can imagine them sitting on the high seas in the cold of the night and tuning in their radios to 2182 or whatever the frequency was, and switching them on and listening, and instead of hearing the did-it of the Morse code, which they were accustomed, they heard music. They had heard Ombra mai fu from Handel's Xerxes being played. The first time music had ever been heard on the radio. And then the booming voice of Aubrey Fessenden broadcasting from Brant Rock, Massachusetts, reciting the Lord's Prayer and wishing them all Godspeed for the year ahead. That is the kind of innovation that built America, and it plays neatly into, I think, the construction of the internet, which is, of course, your world, but it is the foundation on which all of the innovation that you talk about, I think, is built. So thank you very much indeed.